Okay, Sarah Ward, welcome to the Writing with Purpose podcast. You're a novelist, a critic, writer of audio drama as well, articles, short stories, and an experienced judge for writing awards. And you've been on various literary and writing associations as vice chair, and you're currently the treasurer of Welsh crime writing collective Crime Cymru. So you've got a lot of history there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm obviously primarily a writer, but I do like getting involved in reading other people's books, which is why I do a lot of the judging, and also, I guess, you know, organizing things. So I'll get involved in the festivals and so on, just to, add what I know about the industry to sort of try and help other writers, really.
Yeah, and I think as well, just because you're a writer doesn't mean that you don't enjoy reading and getting involved in other things. And I think that,
Exactly,
as a
exactly.
fledgling writer, a lot of the advice that people give to you is to read other people's work.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. At the moment, I'm a judge on the crime fiction and translation dagger run by the Crime Writers Association. So that's for translated crime fiction. But I've done 3 years of that, and it's like I'd really like to do something else. And now I'm going to be a judge on the John Creasy dagger, which is for the first published novel. And that's going to be fascinating because, now I've been published for 10 years. It was going to be really interesting to see what gets published in 2025 as opposed to 2015 when I was first published. It'd be
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, definitely. And happy anniversary as well, because I think
Thank
it's
you.
10 years in June. Is it June, July?
July. July, yeah.
July.
Yeah.
Yeah, congratulations. And this was your first novel, wasn't it? I've got it here in
Bitter
Bitter
chill, yes,
Chill.
it was, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So a few quick fire questions,
Okay.
Sarah. So what's the last book you read?
So the last book I read was by crime writer Sarah Hillary, same name. In fact, she was published just before me, and she had a series and has now gone to psychological thrillers. And the last one was called Sharp Glass, which I've just read.
Yeah, fantastic. My favorite genre as well. And what was your favorite childhood book or author?
So there was a book that I absolutely loved called, and it was called Leo Possessed by Dilys Owen. And I always mention this book because, as well as crime fiction, I love ghost stories, and is a classic ghost story. And I kept the book for years and years and years. And then there was a flood. I put some book stuff into storage, and there was a flood, and it was lost in the flood. But I've just bought it back off eBay or AbeBooks or one of those sites. It's just, and I reread it, and it's just wonderful. It's a wonderful book. But it's out of
Oh,
print, so you have to find an old copy if you want to read it.
ah, right. Oh, fabulous. And what a nice ending to what happened.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
I think
exactly.
when you're a book lover, it's a bit of a tragedy, isn't it? That we talking
Yeah.
about that. We went camping a couple of weekends ago, and my partner's daughter, I forget the name of the author now. She's 10, so it's like a sort of investigation type book for
Yep.
children. And it was lovely. It was a beautiful blue cover. The page edges of the pages were blue as well because I think the books now, the styling that you can have is just
Okay.
amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we had rain all weekend, and
No.
she lost half the color of this book, and it kind of expanded because it got that wet.
Oh no. Oh no.
But she's still got it. But I have thought that maybe we ought to just, get her another one as a
Yeah.
replacement. So, and then final quick question: who would be your ideal author dinner guests, dead or alive?
Well, it was quite hard to think about that really, but I decided it would be all female and it would be people like Emily Bronte, I'd probably because I think she'd be an interesting person. And then I loved the works of Doris Lessing, so I would invite her. She's not still alive. And then somebody like Anne Tyler, she's living, or Anne Patchett I like as well. So all women writers who I just read and would love to have a chat with them about, what they've written.
Yeah, yeah, coffee and cake or a
Yeah,
nice
something like
dinner.
that. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
sounds fabulous. That's the first time I've ever asked that question, and it just popped
Uh,
into my head, and I thought, oh, that'll be a great question to ask. So I think that'll be a firm favourite moving forward because it will also,
Brilliant.
yeah, introduce other listeners to other authors
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
Well,
Yeah.
interestingly, none of them are crime writers, but I suppose I read quite widely. So I'm sure there's plenty of crime writers I could invite as well. It's just that those were the three that popped into my mind.
Yeah, I think it's nice to be able to read widely as well.
Hmm.
I've only started reading widely, can't get that word out, widely, since doing the masters. Before I
Yeah.
was all very much crime or psychological thriller and not a
Right.
great deal else really, unless it was non-fiction. It was something to do
Hmm.
with the business. So yeah, no, I think it's great to be introduced to new talent, shall we
Oh,
say.
good. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Sarah, you write under your name, Sarah Ward,
Yeah.
also Rhiannon Ward, which is your middle name. And you've written the DC Child's books, which is this is the first one in the series, which is set in the Peak District, which is where you used to live. You've got two Gothic thrillers, three Mallory Dawson books, which are set in West Wales, and Death Rights, which is a New England based series. So I'm quite interested to learn a little bit about, what why those different genres, because the gothic and the crime, and maybe even some of the short stories that you've written, are they a different genre as well? So what sort of makes you choose the genre?
Well, I think I was always going to write a crime novel when I first started writing because I was a big, big crime fiction reader all the way since a child into my teens, 20s, 30s. So I think crime was always going to be the book I was going to write to begin with, which is why In Bitter Chill came along. And I wrote, like all my, apart from my latest book, every series has started with what I thought was a standalone. So when I wrote In Bitter Chill, I thought it was a standalone. But when a publisher expressed an interest, they said, "Oh, I think it would be a great series." So I sort of on the hop thought of the series set in the Peak District where the first book had been set. So and at that time, I actually wrote the first book while I was living elsewhere, but I was living in the Peak District by this point. So it seemed really natural to set it there. Apart from crime, though, I've always loved ghost stories. My parents are Welsh. We always told each other ghost stories. And I always wanted to write it, but I was really conscious that I couldn't fit a ghost, any supernatural into my crime novels. So I wrote the two Rhiannon Ward books as Gothic thrillers, and I went historical. And I think partly that was because in my DC Child's books, I was going back in time because they were always cold cases. So the first one was from the 1970s, the next one was from the 80s, and then the next two were from the 80s. And then for the fourth book, The Shrouded Path, I went back to the 1950s. So I was kind of going back in time anyway. So for my two Gothic thrillers, I went to the 1920s and the 1830s. But then I kind of missed crime. I think that's why I went back into crime. I just felt more my natural home really, because what was interesting that my Rhiannon Ward books came out during lockdown. So they sold really, really well on Kindle, but it was really hard to get them in bookshops because bookshops were shut. But when when eventually lockdowns finished and I used to go into bookshops, they were under general fiction. They weren't I would see them as Gothic thrillers, but Gothic, people were putting it in general fiction. And I thought that's not right because, I really do feel I'm a crime writer. So I wrote The Birthday Girl, which for me, the first book in my West Wales series, is really straightforward crime. It's got a former Met detective who becomes a civilian investigator after she's injured. And for me, it was like proper crime book. And again, I wrote it as a standalone, but my publisher, when they picked it up, said, "Oh no, we'd love a series set in West Wales," which is how I came up with the sort of the idea of more Mallory books. So that was a sort of me going back to crime. And I'm still writing those books. And the Death Rights, which is set in New England, I'm working alongside the Mallory Dawson books with those ones. And that again is crime, but it's slightly darker, and it's got an archaeologist as its lead character. And I work with an archaeologist who helps me out with the archaeology bit. So that was a bit of a departure in terms of let's try something new and see how it would work. Not in a place where I live, because I live in West Wales now. So it's not set anywhere I know, although I've been to New England quite a few times. But it's actually this idea of doing something completely different, really.
Yeah. Because I remember when I first met you, you came to the local library in
Mm.
Alsager, Cheshire, Staffordshire border. And I
Yeah.
remember you saying that you liked the research and that, you kept going back in time. And I think, that's part of what you're learning at the same time as well as writing, aren't you? You're writing for ultimately other people, but you're also writing for yourself, and you're going through this journey of learning and being able to put all of that together.
Absolutely. I think it's one of those. So I did a panel yesterday with Ellie Griffiths, who writes the Ruth
Mm.
Galloway books, and she was saying that she's always tried to write what she wants and sort of stretch herself, because so she's, as well as the Ruth Galloway book, she's written other series. And I do feel a bit like that, in as much that, so I've got two series at the moment running simultaneously, but at the same time, I do have an idea in the back of my mind for a standalone, and it's trying to carve out the space, making sure it doesn't impinge on my existing commitments. But, as a writer, I don't want to stick to one thing. If I've got an idea and it wouldn't go into either my series, I do want to be able to explore it and write something. So I think writers do try and, they don't necessarily want to stay in the box. Some writers do, but most don't.
Yeah, I think you see inspiration everywhere, and it's quite difficult to say, no, okay, let's just hold that for a period of time because I need
Yeah,
to finish
yeah.
this project before that project. But
Exactly.
what do you do? Have you got a book of scraps of paper with ideas, or do you keep them electronically, or have you got a system?
No, I'm not a great writer down of things, to be honest. When I was writing my first book, I didn't really go on any courses because I was living in Greece. I was living in Athens and Greece. So I wasn't locked into the writing community. I was just reading loads and loads of stuff. So I wrote my first book more or less in isolation. It was like, this is how I do it. And of course, for someone writing on their own without doing an MA like you've done, it was kind of like I made loads of mistakes and I failed, and some big books. When my first book came out, some that had a review in the Guardian, and it said it was uneven. No, it was positive review, but they said it was uneven, and I totally take that on board because it was just written in, like, oh, let's see if I can write a book. So I did go after I'd got the publishing deal. I did think maybe I should, see how you're actually supposed to do it. So I went on a course, and it was led by another writer, and he said to the class, not to me, if you don't keep a notebook, you're not a proper writer. And I remember thinking, oh, what a thing to say, because not everybody writes everything down. And since then, I've always been really careful not to give out things like that, or like if you want to be a proper writer, you've got to plot or you plot it all out or anything, because there's no absolute way to do anything when it comes to writing a book. Some things make your life easier, and if I could plot my book out from beginning to end, I'm sure my life would be much easier, but it's just not how I write. But yeah, I don't write huge amounts down. I write a little bit down, but I tend to I've got quite a good memory, and I tend to mentally store it away. And I always think if I forget it, then it probably didn't have any legs to it.
Yeah.
It's the keeping it in my brain is the processing it. But then I often do a bit of research. So this book that I'm mulling over at the moment, I'm doing quite a lot of research for the book I'm writing. But then occasionally I see websites and think, oh yeah, that's it, and I just save them in my in my browser. So I'll come back to them. But I don't write huge amounts down. So if I go to a lecture, we had this Crime Cymru weekend the last weekend, and there were various events, and I went along. I was appearing on panels, but I went along to ones, and one was in an archives, and some of the archive stuff was really, really interesting. So I did jot them down because I thought I might actually forget these, and I think it's actually really don't want to forget it. But in terms of things popping into my mind, I tend to not write a huge amount down. I
Yeah.
wish I could, because I think something like the journaling that you do and sort of recommend and so on would be really, really interesting. And I see writers on Instagram with huge notes of what they're going to write, and it seems really grown up way to do it. And I kind of think, oh God, I wish I could do that. But then you have to write your own personality as well, I think.
Yeah, and I think, if you have an idea, if it stays in your head, it can percolate a little bit. And
Yeah,
I do like what you say that, if it's sort of meant to be, it was meant to be, and you will
yeah,
remember it. But, you might
yeah,
see other signs as you're going around. Somebody might say
yeah,
something in a conversation, or you might see something, or maybe read something somewhere that just adds to that idea, and
yeah,
it grows very naturally. I've always been one of those people that writes notes, but I don't always go back to them, so I
no,
know that
that's
it's not always something that is helpful to me.
mm,
Sometimes it can be a little bit more overwhelming.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean I agree with you. I think it's whatever works for you really, and part
yeah,
of writing and reading and how you take information for that. You kind of work something out that helps you do what you
yeah.
want to
I mean,
do.
the only notes I take is that when I'm writing a book, because I'm not plotting huge amounts, I do tend to know how I'm going to end it. But what I do is I get an A4 sheet of paper and I write things that I know I haven't resolved. Because what I do is, because I'm not a plotter, I start at the beginning of a book and I
You're a
just
pantser.
Yeah, I'm a pantster and I just keep going. And so then I'll get to say chapter 5 and I think I know there's something wrong in chapter 1 because what I'm writing in chapter 5 doesn't quite, and I'll make a note of it. And so then I end up with these huge A4 sheets of paper that when I've got the end of the book, I then have to go back and go one by one to, to weave in what I know is wrong. But that's the only way I know how to do it. But what's really I always find really funny about plotting versus pansters is that the plotters think they're like we're the really, sort of organized people because we plot from the beginning to end, where you pansters are, sort of airy and you just do what you want. But I find that really bizarre because I think I'm really organized. I start at chapter 1 and I get going and I end up in, say, chapter 40. Whereas the plotters will say, oh, yeah, I wrote chapter 10 today and tomorrow I'm going to write chapter 40 and then I'm going to write chapter 13. And it's like, how is that more organized than me
Yeah.
doing it sequentially? But of course, they've all got it all plotted out. So they feel like, oh, I want to write a really, grim scene today. I'll go to chapter whatever it is. So I do see why, but I don't think it makes them more organized than me, to be honest.
Yeah. And I think when you get to the end of the book and you read something, the reader's got no idea how you started, how what
No,
the middle was like. And,
no,
they
exactly.
just get the good stuff at the end of it. Yeah, for the one that I'm writing at the moment, I got a little bit confused and I thought I don't want to trip myself up because I think
Mm.
I'm a bit more of a pantster.
Yeah.
And I heard that people, they write and the characters sort of take over. And I thought, oh, I don't know what that really means. But mine were doing that, certainly a couple of them in particular. So I just went with it. But then I got to a point where I thought, oh, now this person needs to make a bit more of an appearance. That needs to
Yeah.
be fleshed out a
Yeah.
little bit more. And I think making notes on that so that I could go back and say, okay, well, there needs to be more of this person's backstory perhaps there. That was what I was sort of making notes on so far.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have got a sheet where I've listed chapters because I've had to move them around
Yeah.
based on, oh no, there's another idea, but that needs to come before what I've
Yeah.
written
Yeah.
already. So I think that kind of a plan has helped me.
Oh, that's
Um,
good.
but yeah, it's
Yeah.
these resources. I mean, journaling was a big part of the masters that I did. They said to
Yeah.
keep a journal, and it was I guess on a couple of different levels, really. One for your ideas and to, for
Yeah.
developing, but also for you from an emotional point of view, for,
Yeah.
how
I
are
can
you
see that.
getting on? Because I think
Mm.
a lot of the characters in books, they are based on the writer's experiences as
Yeah.
well, aren't they?
Yeah.
And you can
Yeah.
only, you could go a lot deeper
Mm.
into a character if you've experienced something
That makes
yourself, even though it's fiction.
that's interesting. When people journal, are you encouraged to do it by hand, are you, rather than writing to
Yes.
something? Yeah,
Yeah.
seriously.
I mean, of course, that doesn't work for some people. An
Yeah.
electronic app is better, but
Okay.
yeah, just sort of the connection really with the brain and the hand and what you're
Hand, yeah.
writing is
I
encouraged.
can
Yeah.
see that. I think my problem is I've got really terrible handwriting, and I used when I was a child, I used to get really told off for it by my parents. And they'd go to a parents' evening, and they'd get out my book, and it would be my exercise books, and they'd be really bad. And my parents used to come home and give me a right rollicking about the whole thing.
Oh,
And I remember, and then it's like, you need good handwriting. Well, of course, now, what do we handwrite? Very, very little. But even my signature in books, when I'm signing books and I see people next to me with these huge flourishes, and it's like, oh, God, even my signature looks really rubbish. I don't know what it is. I don't know. I don't know why I've got such bad handwriting, but it is really, really bad. And I suppose that's what I know when I write notes for people, they say they can't read read them. So it would be a sort of journaling and then trying to, make it better. But interesting to hear you don't necessarily have to do it that way, that you could journal straight into an app or something. That's really,
yeah, yeah. There's quite a few apps, mobile apps. There's also one that I tried for a while, which was 750 words, which was good. As it sounds, it encourages you to write 750 words a day. But I also think that, a journal is there for when you need it and when you
Yeah,
want to put something
yeah.
into it. You don't have to do it every day, which I think is a misconception. And with some of them, I think people feel as though they have to write in it every day, and if they don't, then there's
Yeah,
something wrong. And
yeah,
it kind of defeats the object really of
yeah.
keeping a journal. So I stopped using one of these apps which encouraged to use it every day because
Okay.
I got to the point it was 10 o'clock at night and I was like, oh, I haven't written in it. I need
Oh
to write in.
no.
So then I'd get anxious because I was like, I'm really tired. I want to go to bed, but I've got
Yeah,
all
yeah,
these
of
words
course.
that I need to write. So
Yeah,
um yeah, I think it's coming back to finding a system
yeah, yeah,
that works for
completely.
you. So you mentioned already that you loved reading when you were younger. You loved the ghost stories.
Mm.
So what did reading and writing play in your childhood and that led into that author's journey? How did it all start?
Yeah, so I was never really a writer before I wrote my first book, which is a bit weird, really. I don't know why I thought I could write a whole book rather than a short story or a small piece of fiction or something. I don't. I was a massive, massive reader, so I went into one of the children's panels at the weekend, and there were children there who were It's like yourself, they just loved books. But I was really, really into crime. So right from the early Enid Blyton, Secret Seven, Famous Five. Then as a teenager, I read a lot of Agatha Christie. So I read all the sort of golden age detectives in my 20s, in my teens. And then in my 20s, I discovered these American PI books by Sarah Paretsky and Sue Grafton, which I absolutely loved as well. And then in my 30s, I was reading a lot of Scandinavian crime fiction, sort of Nordic noir. And this is where setting became really, really important to me because what I really liked about the Scandi books was that the crimes really couldn't happen anywhere else. You couldn't have picked up the crime and transposed it to, I don't know, Britain or France or whatever. They were really, really rooted in the landscape, and they had a massive influence on me. So what happened was I was living in Greece. I went down to Greece with my ex-husband, and I was teaching down there. And I was teaching in the evening, which meant that during the day I had basically nothing to do. And I suppose when you're transposed away from your family and from libraries and all the sort of things that attach you in British culture, and you're just there in the sunshine, it was like I need to do something during the day. So I thought I am actually going to try and write a book. And that's what I did. I wanted to make it very setting focused and atmospheric but set in Britain. And I felt that the Peak District, which was near where I grew up, had that sort of where anything the feeling that anything could happen really. And so yeah, I just put pen to paper and saw what came out and what the book that went through different edits and so on that became In Bitter Chill, which you showed, which was published in 2015. But it was quite a long journey to get that from that point. I think I probably started it about 2012 was
Yeah.
when I first started writing it. And like most first books, you spend a long, long time doing it because you don't really know what you're doing.
Yeah.
But
And
I've
because
always
it,
been a reader over a writer until I started writing. Yeah.
yeah, and now you're both. Interesting then too, because this was the first one, and the Connie is
Yeah.
the person who's sort of based around for the rest of the series, isn't it? Did you
Yeah.
know that at the time? I know you said when the publisher, when it got the publishing deal, they said we'd like to see this as a series. But was it
Yeah.
when you heard that, did you think, oh yes, she's going to be, the regular main character, or because the other character, Rachel, who
Yes. Yeah.
the genealogist, have I said that
Yeah.
right? I didn't want to say the
Yeah.
wrong word then.
No, no, that's fine. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
she also could make a regular character, couldn't she, with what
I
she
know.
uncovers?
Yeah, I often think that was actually crossroads where I could have or part, a split in the path where I could have gone either way. Actually, In Bitter Chill was first marketed as a D.I. Sadler book. So my main two detectives, there was Connie Charles and D.I. Sadler. And my publisher had it as a D.I. Sadler book. The feedback as soon as it was published was everyone liked Connie. So they just said, no, we ought to rebrand them as Connie Books because, we really, really like her, which was fair enough. But yeah, a part of me thinks, how would the series have gone if I focused on Rachel? But then I would have had to make everything a genealogy, focused book. But then can see how that might have worked actually. Maybe it's something I would park in the future because
Yeah.
I'm really interested in family history and genealogy, and I do an awful lot of work around it. And so it's something I could bring back. It's sort of semi-professionally. I have articles in Who Do You Think You Are magazine. I've been on TV in Iceland talking about genealogy. So it's kind of a semi-professional thing I do. So I could always pick it up. Maybe not with Rachel again, but I think there's something there, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, and I kind of got that feel that it's quite often now because I know some of the ways that writers approach books. I every time I read a book now, I think now what part of that character is the author?
Oh, really?
I was reading something the other week that was archaeology. You just mentioned that your new ones is
Mm,
archaeology,
mm.
and I've always had quite an interest in archaeology. I always
Okay.
that if I didn't go down because I went into marketing, that was my
Mm.
sort of career
Yeah.
to date, and but I did want to be Indiana Jones when I was younger.
I would have, you know what? If I had my time again, I think I'd be an archaeologist as well because the Death Rites is one of the few books I actually base it on somebody. So she's based on my friend Sarah Tarlow, who's an archaeology professor of archaeology in Leicester. So, but she's fascinating, and the things she do is like wandering around churchyards and looking for gibbets, and in the countryside and stuff. That is absolutely what I'm interested in a sort of unprofessional level, amateur level. So, yeah, no, it sounds fascinating to be honest.
Yeah, it does. Brilliant. So, we've kind of touched on this, but I'm not sure whether you actually said
Mhm.
what you did. But do you write for yourself first, or do you write for the readers first?
I think ultimately I write for myself. I think because I read so much crime fiction, and I can usually tell by the first chapter if I want to read the book. And that's not to say I don't read the book, because when I'm judging, I have to read the whole thing. But I can usually tell even by the first page whether or not I want, it's going to be an interesting story. I don't know what it is. I always say with writing, there's some kind of magic that's really hard to describe. It's like when I'm writing a book, something will suddenly come together in chapter 30, and it's like a magic. It's like you've done all this spell over everything you've written before. I'm a pantser. I don't really know what everything's going, and suddenly it all comes together. And I just think with books there is a bit of magic really in it. So I tend to write for myself, as in with my critical head on. Would I want to carry on reading? And things have changed in the 10 years I was published, because my first books were published in hardback, and Kindle was quite not new, but my publisher weren't really embracing it at the time. So it was very much written for a hardback reader, and you could sort of start quite slowly because someone had forked out, say, 15 quid at the time for a hardback, and they were going to immerse themselves into it. Now, Kindle and audio have become so popular that you do really need to make sure you hit the ground running in your first
Yeah.
chapters. And so I think it's quite important to keep that critical head thinking, am I starting too softly? Is the person going to carry on reading? Or more, would I carry on reading? I can't have a mythical person in my head because I think I meet too many people, too many readers, and they're all completely different. And I don't know how I would choose one of them to be the person I write for. So it's much easier that I write for myself, really. And I write the book that I would want to read, about the subject I would want to read, and in the tone that I would want to read. So, tone is really, really important in writing. It's not the writer's voice per se, because I think I have quite a distinctive writer's voice. People say they can hear me speak when I'm
Mm.
writing. So I never had a problem finding my voice, but sometimes I have a problem finding the tone, because I think, what is the subject matter and how dark do I want to go, or how not dark do I want to go? And that's often what I spend my time thinking about. How am I going to write this particular book? So my New England series are quite a bit darker than my Welsh-based series, and it's just the way it's gone. But also the characters have dictated it, and the setting have dictated it. So I spent a lot of time thinking how I would want to read a book in that particular series. So yeah, that was a long answer for I write for myself,
Yeah,
basically.
well, yeah, it was a long answer, but I think you packed that answer full of tips for aspiring writers, thinking about the plot and the characters
Mm,
and how that's going to unravel and the tone of
yeah.
voice and all great things to think about. And I think most people seem to, if I've asked that question, have said that they write for themselves first, but it's
Right.
almost as though you're writing for something that you've not yet written.
Yeah.
So, and then that's part of the enjoyment of the writing
Yeah.
process
Of
before
course.
you get to, all the
Mm.
editing, and then of course the sale and the marketing side of it. So, yeah, no, that's great about, because I was going to ask you, was there any advice that you would offer to, an aspiring author who might be, a little bit stuck and, have
Mm.
some of those beliefs around, oh, I'm never going to make it. But I think, yeah, just start, right for yourself.
Start and keep going. The best thing you can do is try and finish a book as well. Because when I finished In Bitter Chill, I wasn't happy with the ending, but I'd got to it and then I reworked it. But there's nothing like. I mean, my main piece of writing advice, and it's the thing I've learned, is when I first started and I'd written the whole book, the first draft, it was like really tense in terms of I was scared if I moved something in chapter 12, the whole book would collapse. That was my main worry. And I was like, how do writers make a change and the book doesn't go like a souffle, sort of collapse in on itself? And I've learned that it doesn't. It does mean if you move something in chapter 12, you then have to feed through it, but it can be mechanical. You can be as easy as doing a search for that term that you keep using and changing it every time. And it doesn't matter if you don't get it completely right, because at some point you're going to put it aside and then you're going to pick it up and read it afresh. But I think that was holding me back, making changes that to make my book better. Was that I had this delicately balanced plot that if I did anything, that would be the end of it. And I've learned it's absolutely not. So
Yeah.
that would be my main advice: is tinker with it as much as you want, because you will get it back to the shape you wanted. Yeah.
Yeah, have the confidence to do that.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Great advice. Thank you.
Mm.
So, are you with all of your books? Are you published traditionally published with all of them?
Yes, with all of them, I'm traditionally published. Different types of publishers. I've had very traditional publishers. Canelo, who I'm with at the moment, started off as a digital first publisher, but they're now they're a traditional publisher with books in the bookshop. But no, I've never self-published.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to hear people's opinions on both of them, because I think there's pros and cons with both, isn't there? And again, it's just what works for you really, and what's how do you want to get it out there? And at the London Book Fair, there was a couple of authors talking, and they were the amount of books that they wrote. I think somebody said that they wrote 14 books in one year because they were
Oh my
self-publishing.
goodness!
And I just thought, to me, I would be concerned about the depth of the
Yeah, yeah, of
story
course,
in
yeah,
writing that many books, and how much
yeah,
research has gone into that, or how much of it is actually your own work.
yeah. I mean, I have heard quite a well-known author here in Wales, and he writes quite a few books a year, and his length is about 50,000 words, which is significantly less
Yeah.
than traditional. But what he said was, and I completely agree with it, is that what all his readers want is a new book. So
Mm.
they want a new book with the characters and so on. So he can write a bit shorter, especially as he sells really well on Kindle, because they're just wanting, the series to carry on. So, I mean, I suppose 14 is a lot, but then some of my favorite writers, like Georges Simenon, who wrote the Maigret books, he was writing like one a week or something. So now people write at different paces, really.
Yeah, and I suppose, if you're not the treasurer of
Yeah,
an
yeah, if you're not doing other
organization and
things.
helping out with things, you've got a little bit more time, I suppose, just to dedicate to the writing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about journaling already. Am I right in thinking that that's not something that you really use as your process, or for personal use?
No, no, I haven't ever used it. Having said that, when I got divorced, and it was, like most divorces, it was a bit upsetting and painful. Somebody recommended I just write it down, how I was feeling, writing it down, and I did. And it did work really well, but I was left with these sort of sheets of paper and thinking, what do I do with them? And so when I felt better, I just threw them out,
Yeah.
basically, because I didn't need it anymore. But having done that for once, I can imagine it. I would do it again in a time of crisis. That I
Mm.
would write down. It's just a way of getting all the upset and
Yeah.
everything without, having to. Because I did find that when I spoke to other people, I felt better, even
Mm.
though nothing had changed. I felt better. So it was one of those times where I've always realized that people will come to your help when you're upset, because I'm quite a self-reliant person, and I'm quite a private person. I tend not to sort of, even saying this about my divorce, I don't think I've ever spoken to public about it, but we're talking in terms of journalism. So I found talking to friends and saying, "Oh God, I can't believe this has happened to me," blah blah blah. That made me feel better. And so when one suggested just one, if no one's around, just write it down. It definitely did work. It really worked for me. So I've got complete admiration for people who journal and find it really really helpful, because I can imagine in another time of crisis I would do exactly the same. Mm.
Yeah, yeah, you'd already had that experience of it being helpful, and you're feeling better at the end of it. So that's
Yes.
kind of just in your mind for if anything, and again, that's a great use of journal. It's there when you need it, and that
Yeah,
doesn't have
yeah,
to be continual. So
yeah.
yeah, thank you. So another question that I always like to ask people, because reading, writing is a big part of my life, and so is nature and being outside. I
Yeah.
find that a lot of my inspiration, when if I'm writing, even if it's just something for the business, and I'm writing a social media post or something like that, then I do draw inspiration from outside.
Okay.
Specifically, if I sit with somewhere in a wood, or next to a large tree or something like
Yeah.
that, I
Yeah.
find that it's a space where I draw a lot of energy, and I get quite creative and inspiration. So, because of where you've lived, the Peak District, Greece, I'm not sure how, I have been to Greece, but I'm not sure how
Mhm.
much of it's not nature
Mhm.
like or woodland, is
No,
it
no.
particularly? Now, Wales, of course.
Yeah.
What role does nature play in your life?
I find the landscape really inspiring, like yourself, and I like stories around the landscape as well. So I think a wood per se, for example, is interesting enough, but I like to know the story behind the wood, where it came from, how it was built. For example, my third book in my Mallory Dawson series set in West Wales is set in the Breckford Forest. Now, one of the reasons I put it there is because my ancestors lived there, but the Breckford Forest has got a really interesting back history, because it used to be traditionally planted trees, and it was called the Gothic forest, and it's got a really strong significance in Welsh history. But then after the First World War, so my family were tenant farmers on there, but after the First World War, when they needed to replant forests for fuel and so on, they purchased the land, so all the tenant farmers got kicked off, and they planted the big pine trees. So when you go down to Breckford now, it's full of pine trees, and that's where I set it. But there's so much you can weave into the story of that woodland. You've got the old trees, you've got the new pines that are all uniform and so on, and you've got the logging, which feels quite brutal really, and you've got the sort of scarring of the landscape, because the landscape isn't the landscape of my ancestors, it's the landscape of 20th century Britain really, 20th century Wales. So I love anything to do with the stories around it. So similarly, The Birthday Girl, which is the first in my Welsh book, it's set on a fictional island, but it's like Caldy Island, which is an island off Tenby. And again, I weave in the story of how quite a lot of our Welsh islands have got a sort of religious history. So they were often, Bardsey Island is the island of 20,000 saints, for example, where 20,000 saints are supposed to be buried there. And Caldy Island has got a monastery. So I do get inspiration from the sea, from the mountains. I used to love the Peak District in the mountains. Hills have a big, big thing for me. When I met my husband, my second husband, he was living in Lincolnshire. And he would occasionally come out, would come and stay with me. But then I would go and stay with him sometimes in Lincolnshire. And Lincolnshire is so flat. I used to sort of leave, so I would go home and say about 10 at night. And I can drive through the Peak District in the hills, no problem. Can't see a thing, really steep hills, narrow lanes, no problem. I find it inspiring, even at night, it's something special. The flatness of Lincolnshire freak me out. No way to orientate myself. Every road looked exactly the same. I'd have my sat nav on. And I was just, and I don't know, you can imagine just being stuck there forever. And I'd be so grateful when I was out of Lincolnshire. I love Lincoln and I love Lincolnshire, but in the dark, the flatness is absolutely really oppressive. So I do, sort of, draw my energy from the landscape, I would say, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I understand what you were saying as you were talking there. I was thinking about Telford as a new town,
Okay.
and it's just roundabouts,
Yeah.
and everything. I think is almost like a probably if you were to look at it from the aerial point of view, it's all grids. There's
Right.
yeah, everything's sort of quite regimented and
Hmm.
very structured and the
Yeah.
same. And
Yeah.
yeah, I understand what you mean about the the hills and going up and
Yeah.
down
Yeah. Yeah.
because I grew up on the edge of the Peak District in the Staffordshire Moorlands.
Yeah. Yeah. That's lovely
We'd
around there,
got
isn't
Console near us. I don't know
it?
if you're
Okay.
familiar with Console and Ipstones,
Okay.
and that sort of area. Very, very steep woodland,
Okay.
canals, rivers, and that. So there was everything kind of natural was
Oh, that's,
there.
mm,
And yeah, you turn a corner and there's something different, and it's
yes.
something. There is something quite
Mm,
eerie but magical as
mm,
well about
yeah.
that and
Yeah.
familiar as well if you've grown up in that way. Am
Yeah.
I right in thinking, Sarah, did you mentioned something in when you spoke at the library that you lived in at the time you lived in a little village and it was there was the church peak the highest?
Yeah, yeah. So I
Yeah.
lived in Shelmorton. So the church was the highest church in England. I think there's
Mm.
villages higher than Shelmorton. It was high though. We were always getting cut off in the snow and so on. But what was really strange is when I moved to Wales, I thought it's going to be much, much milder. But actually, we're now in a coastal climate, so we get the wind coming off the sea. I mean, we're having beautiful weather at the moment, so of course it's lovely because I'm 20 minutes from the sea in the car, so I've got lots of nice beaches to go to. But in the winter, the wind whips off that sea and howls around where I live. And as I said, I'm 20 minutes inland, so God knows what it's like if you live on the sea. But gives a sort of slightly eerie feel as well. I do love anything that's slightly odd in the weather and in the
Mm.
landscape. And it's why I write crime and why I like ghost stories, I think.
Yeah, I think describing that setting, the environment and the weather, you can just visualize it. Have bookmarked a couple of sentences in two of
Okay.
your books. If you don't mind, I'll read
Yeah.
it. So the first one is from In Bit and Chill. The landscape was stunning, whatever the weather, from the slate grey hues of the wintry hills overhung with heavy black clouds to the verdant green of a summer's day. It was a landscape to catch your breath and wonder.
Okay.
And I think that, it does that kind of landscape, it does. Wonder is a brilliant word
Mm,
for that because it does, particularly if you are present in whatever's happening
yeah.
around you at the time. I
Yeah.
think you can really gain a lot from what you see and feel with the
Yeah.
weather. There's a good journaling technique actually, which is writing about your internal weather report, describing how you feel about something, someone, just as, how you woke up that morning and describing that, but describing how you feel in a weather
Uh,
report, which is quite intricate and
oh, that
interesting
sounds
for
good.
people. I know somebody that's how she starts her day every day. She does the
Oh,
same
really?
thing. She wakes up, right, what's the internal weather report like? And then, she gets on with her day.
Oh, that's really good.
And then this one, which is the shadowing, which is your second one, isn't it?
Yes.
The
Yeah.
quickening was the first,
That's
yes.
right.
So this is the one that I got from you at the library. Dawn revealed dark, tin-coloured clouds hanging over the flat countryside, which let loose a torrent of needles. The carriage passed through the bitter squall, rain lashing against the doors, adding to the sense of claustrophobia. You could just visualize that and just
Yay.
the tin colored clouds and
Yeah, yeah.
describing it in something that we can relate to. I think is just helps to draw you in as a reader.
It does, yeah, yeah, it does, and that's bad weather as well, and you can imagine that in Peak District. Well, that's Nottinghamshire, I think, but Peak District, Wales here. The sort of you're enclosed in something. Even last over the weekend, I was the hotel room was really high up, and I could hear the wind, the rain on the Velux windows.
Yeah.
Sort of really belting down. Yeah, it's getting that sense of we're safe, but only because we've got shelter, really. Yeah.
Yeah, there's just one thin membrane between
Yeah,
us
exactly.
and the outside world. Yeah. So, Sarah, what's next for you in 2025? You've got a couple more books coming out this year, haven't you?
Yeah.
So, yeah, what's in store?
So in June, I've got my second New England book called Quiet Bones that has my archaeologist in it as well. I really, really enjoyed writing that one. So that's out on the 2nd of June. And then in November, I've got another Mallory book. It's my fourth Mallory book, and it's set in a girls' school. I've used Tregaron, which is a town nearby me, but it's in this old house, so it's got a very sort of claustrophobic feel about what's going on in this girls' school. So those are the two books I've got out at the moment, coming this year, and then I'm writing at the moment my third book in the New England series. But I can't tell you what it's about because obviously as a pantser, I don't really know.
You don't know yet. And is that the idea that you had that you mentioned at the start, or is this another one?
No, this is another. So this is another. I've got an idea that's just going to be parked for the minute. It's not going to fit into a series, so it's just parking.
It's going to be a standalone. You did say
Yeah.
that. Yeah, great. So, what's the best way, Sarah, for people to contact you if they want to buy the books? Where's the best place that they can go for that? And where have you got any events lined up where people can meet you?
So I've got a local indie bookshop called Gwisgo Bookworm. They're in Aberavon. They often have signed copies of my books. So if you wanted a signed copy, go there. But my books are available on Amazon and Waterstones and your local indie as well. I'm on Facebook as Sarah Ward Crime. I have a public page there, and especially on a Saturday, a lot of readers, we chat about what we're reading, and we have a nice little community there. I'm also on Instagram as Sarah Ward Crime. I do have a website people contact me through, and it's called Crime Pieces. Back in the day, because I used to blog about books before I didn't have time to do that anymore, but I've got Crime Pieces. So I'm easily findable on social media.
Yeah. Perfect. So I'll include those in the show notes as well. We've also mentioned various organisations and associations and events and things. So I'll include those in the show notes too.
Oh, brilliant.
And then anybody else that we've mentioned. Is there anything else that you'd like to share? It's been fabulous to chat to you, by the way. You're very easy to kind of ask questions to, and what you say leads on to something else.
Oh, thank you. No, I've really, really enjoyed it. And thinking about nature and writing, I sometimes forget how much inspiration I get from being out in nature. So it's really been lovely to chat to you about it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you're more than welcome. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Anna, and good luck with your own writing as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to today's Writing with Purpose podcast. Having conversations with fellow writers or adventure enthusiasts brings two of my biggest loves in life together, writing and nature connection. I've been a copywriter and content creator for 23 years, but my passion is writing for well-being, and I'm on a mission to share the benefits that putting pen to paper has for personal wellness with as many people as possible. If you want to learn more about writing for your well-being and journaling techniques, please connect with me in my Facebook group, Journaling with Anna.